Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our event on the topic of truth, justice, and racial equality with our distinguished guest, Glenn Loury. Our event this afternoon is part of a fall series of events at the college on the larger theme of discrimination and the search for justice and truth. My name is Edmund Santuri. I'm a professor of religion and philosophy at St. Olaf College and Morrison Family Director of the college's Institute for Freedom and Community, the institute that is supporting our event this afternoon, and the general theme and the series of events this fall. The purpose of St. Olaf's Institute for Freedom and Community is to stimulate and encourage free inquiry and meaningful debate of important political and social issues among students, faculty, staff, and the larger public. By exploring diverse ideas about politics, markets, and society, the Institute aims to challenge presuppositions, question easy or comfortable answers, and foster constructive civil dialogue among those with differing values and contending points of view. For help in organizing our event, very special thanks go to the staff of the Institute, Assistant Director Tanya Charlotte Paley, whom you've just heard from, and Administrative Assistant Dawn Bartz. Nothing of what you see and hear this afternoon happens without their intelligent, diligent energies, and we're much appreciative. Thanks also to Molly Work and Carrie Vanderbeen of St. Olaf Marketing Communications, and to Jeff O'Donnell and his Broadcast Media Services crew for their contributions. Thanks also to the St. Olaf students who are helping us this afternoon, and to St. Olaf faculty who participated last July in a faculty seminar where we addressed some of the issues that are being raised in our series this fall. We are pleased to have with us this afternoon Glenn Loury, who is the Merton P. Stoltz Professor of Economics at Brown University. Professor Lowry holds the BA in Mathematics from Northwestern University and the PhD in Economics from MIT. His distinctions and honors are legion. He was the first African American to be awarded tenure in economics at Harvard University. He is a distinguished fellow of the American Economics Association, a member of the American Philosophical Society and U.S. Council on Foreign Relations, and a fellow of the Econometric Society and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Professor Lowry has published and lectured widely on various topics in economic theory. He is also among the nation's leading commentators on racial inequality. He has published more than 200 essays and reviews in journals of public affairs in the US and abroad. He is a contributing editor at the Boston Review, and for many years a contributing editor at the New Republic. He's the author of a number of books, including The Anatomy of Racial Inequality, published by Harvard University Press in 2002. And he's the primary author of the book Race, Incarceration, and American Values, published by MIT Press in 2008. He is a host of a podcast called The Glenn Show, on which matters of race and social policy are items of frequent discussion with important guest interlocutors, people like John McWhorter, Tyler Cowen, Michelle Kerr, and Michael Fortner. It's an exceedingly lively show, full of intellectual content, and I recommend it highly if you haven't seen it. Much more could be said in description of Professor Lowry's achievements, but enough has been said to mark his extraordinary distinction. We are grateful for his being with us tonight. Would you please join me in welcoming our special guest, Glenn Loury. Glenn, a little over a decade ago, a man named Christopher Allen Bracey, who is currently interim dean of George Washington University Law School, published a book entitled Saviors or Sellouts: The Promise and Peril of Black Conservatism, from Booker T. Washington to Condoleezza Rice. In that book, Bracey, himself an African American but a liberal, was trying to understand the phenomenon of black conservatism. He devoted a section of the book to Glenn Loury. He identified you, among others, as a black conservative, though he noted some liberal turns in your views at the time that he was writing. And in fact, your historical relationship with conservatism has been, even since then, enormously dynamic and complex. But more generally, Bracy posed in the book the following provocative question, and I think it was intended to be provocative, and it is this. What exactly does it mean to be a black conservative, and why would anyone choose to become one? And I thought we might start in similarly provocative fashion by putting to you a variation on Bracy's question. So, with respect to matters of race, racial equality and inequality, the pursuit of justice in racial matters, the pursuit of truth in these matters, what exactly does it mean to be a black conservative, and why would anyone choose to become one?
Okay. I mean, I think the first part of the question is pretty easy. What it means to be a black conservative, and by the way, I am not confessing to being a black conservative, is that you happen to be black and you are a conservative. This is not complicated. Why would anyone choose to be one is a question that befuddles me. Why not? Are you saying that in virtue of a person being black, or perhaps what you mean is authentically black? Perhaps the question is, would a truly black person be a conservative? Are you saying that in virtue of a person being black, there's something problematic or paradoxical about them embracing conservatism? After all, I don't know, 40% or something like that of the population of the country is conservative. What would it mean for there to be no black conservatives? That would be, it seems to me, the anomalous condition. There's a long history of conservative thought amongst African Americans going all the way back. The African American church is conservative, at least on cultural matters, to a very substantial degree, and it's an important cultural thrust, an important stream of African American thinking in the history of black people in the country. Is conservatism the enemy of black people? That sounds to me more like a partisan Democratic Party trope than a defensible socio-political position. Conservatism is intrinsically the enemy of black people. Black people have a vested interest in high taxes, have a vested interest in abortion, in making it not so hard to get across the border and not so hard to deal with people who have illegally crossed the border. These are all, I'm thinking, liberal positions. And the idea that black people somehow, in virtue of being black, should be led to embrace those positions, it befuddles me. So, all right, I haven't really answered you. I've in a way, questioned the question, but let me answer the question. If you're sitting, as I was, in Chicago in the late 1960s as a young man, watching what was happening in the early years after the Civil Rights Movement, or if you're sitting in Detroit, as I was as a young professor of economics at the University of Michigan, watching what's happening in that city in the mid and the late 1970s, or if you're sitting at the table when they're debating welfare reform in the mid-1990s, watching what's happening to the African-American family and so on, it's entirely possible that you might think, what the liberal Democrats are doing is not proving to be so good for my people. They're fostering dependency. Suppose I thought that dependency on the government was a bad thing and that autonomy and self-reliance was a good thing. Have I betrayed black people by thinking that? I don't think so. Suppose I had some questions about affirmative action as a permanent institution to remedy the underrepresentation of African Americans at colleges and universities. Worried that, for example, by creating a different dispensation for assessing African American students, we were inviting a patronization of those students. That's a conservative view. Is it somehow not black? It could well be in the interest of African Americans. Suppose I worried about the consequences of criminal victimization in African American communities, worried about the security in person and property of my people and decided because of that law and order wasn't such a bad thing for black people. Is there something anomalous or in need of explanation about that? So not every African American is going to find themselves being a conservative. Most African Americans are not going to find themselves being conservatives. Yes, the Republican Party has often stood against the interests of African Americans, but that no African American could ever be conservative in their basic instincts and political opinions, that, it strikes me, would be allowing identity. I'm an African American, loyal to African Americanness, having to be black, being authentically black, being black the way that I'm taught being black is supposed to be. It would allow identity to trump my rationality and my individuality. I'm a human being first. I think about politics and I come to the conclusions that I come to. Doesn't stop me from being black. Sometimes those opinions are conservative. No apology is being offered for that here.
Okay. You mentioned affirmative action and your attitude toward affirmative action, casting in a somewhat in a negative form in your remarks. As I understand it, there has been a kind of development or oscillation in your views on affirmative action. Early on, you had some reservations about it, but then you talked more positively about it, and now you've returned to a position which is somewhat more critical. Am I getting that trajectory right? And if so, what has been involved in the unfolding of your views on that matter?
Well, it's a sacred cow, you know. I mean, I once had a friend who said to me in a discussion, an African-American conservative, who said to me, he said, you know, affirmative action for black people, it's a little bit like the issue of Israel for Jewish people. It's a make or break issue. It's a life or death issue. There's only one correct position to take on that issue. Otherwise, you're disloyal to the group. And there is, I think, no small amount of truth to that. But you've asked me about my own thinking. So early in my career, I wrote a dissertation at MIT in economic theory called Essays in the Theory of the Distribution of Income, and half of it was speculating about how one might explain the persistence of the economic disadvantage of African Americans in an ongoing way, even after the establishment, more or less, of a non-discrimination laws and such. What could account for the persistence of black disadvantage? And I argued that the civil rights laws only held sway in the formal transactions that we engage in the marketplace and such. They could govern how a landlord would behave vis-a-vis a tenant, how an employer would behave vis-a-vis a prospective employee, a banker vis-a-vis someone who submits a loan application. But they could not govern the civil rights laws, the non-discrimination principle, could not govern informal social relations, who it is we decide to befriend or marry or accept as a neighbor, cohabitate with, live in the same neighborhood. I've reasoned further that human development had aspects to it that depended upon formal transactions, people's opportunity to go to college or whatever it might be, to get a job where they could acquire training and develop their skills, but that human development also depended upon resources that were only available through the informal social relations that connect people outside of the view of the state, outside of the governance of law. And that because social stigma disadvantaging blacks infected those social relationships, the fact of equal civil rights law would not guarantee truly equal opportunity for black human development, and therefore might not guarantee an elimination of the gap of economic disadvantage affecting African Americans. I know that took me a long time to say, and please bear with me because I think it's important for me to lay out that framework. On the basis of that concern, the concern that racism in the past could have permanent effects because its consequences would be carried over through time and across generations via the disadvantaged social relations that African Americans experienced. I argued that the state should take some proactive steps to further the goal of racial equality. The colorblind norm should not rule with respect to state action in the face of a history of discrimination, given the reality of ongoing social disadvantage and stigma for African Americans. That's what I argued. That makes me pro-affirmative action. In that very general sense, the sense of laissez-faire is not enough. Saying that we've got a level playing field now, but ignoring the fact that what had gone on for 150 years is not enough. So in principle, from very early on in my career, I was friendly to the idea that intervention by the government with the goal of promoting African American equality was a good thing. On the other hand, observing the consequences of the use of differential standards for judging African American performance, that is to say, and let me not be obscure, you're admitting people to an elite enterprise, like studying engineering at MIT, being an undergraduate at Harvard, something like that. UC Berkeley, Stanford, Caltech, something like that. Medical school, high-end law school, etc. You're already selecting from the right tail of the distribution of performance within the population, regardless of race. You have self-consciously declared yourself to be elite. But you also want to be diverse. You want to be elite, but you don't want to be lily white. You want to be quote unquote inclusive. And so you bring into your practice of selection standards when judging African American applicants that differ substantially from the standards that you're using for others. You're selecting elites, but you're using a different cutoff, a different threshold for selecting African Americans into that enterprise. I worried that that practice, not as a transitional matter, but as a permanent way of doing business, would undermine the integrity of African American achievement, would cast a pall over the presence of African Americans in elite pursuits because everyone would know that the same standards for selecting them hadn't been employed, that it would create bad incentives because people would know that they didn't have to necessarily perform as well on the law school admissions test or in their college GPA in order to have a real shot of getting into the law school. If they were black, a different standard was being applied to them. I distinguished in my thinking between a transitional program in which, noting history, one undertook to increase black presence, but with the idea that in the fullness of time, similar treatment for black applicants and white would be employed. I distinguished between a transitional use of affirmative action and the permanent reliance on it, and I reasoned that the permanent reliance on it ultimately was inconsistent with what I was calling true racial equality. True racial equality is equality of dignity and respect. It's equality of standing and of performance. And I reasoned that if the use of test scores to select students was justifiable at all, then the use of different test scores to select black and white students would not be justifiable if the goal in the long run was racial equality. I stand by that. Affirmative action is problematic. So, early in my career, I wanted to recognize that laissez-faire attitudes toward racial equality were not sufficient because history casts a long shadow. Later in my career, and with a little bit of life experience under my belt, I came to the conclusion that permanent reliance on differential standards for judging black people was no way for black people to walk around with our heads held high and confident that we were being respected by those with whom we were interacting. Performance would ultimately be the currency of the realm. If we were not able to develop our performative skills to the point where we didn't need to rely on differential treatment, we would not be truly equal. I want equality for my people. And that's why my views on affirmative action have shifted.
So as I'm understanding what you're saying, affirmative action was justified if you could see a termination point. Is that right? That is to say, it would lead to a state of affairs under which, or it could foreseeably lead to a state of affairs under which it would no longer be necessary. But if there was any evidence to suggest that this is turning into a permanent process or it's not moving in the appropriate direction, then that's reason to reconsider this as a policy or a practice.
That's part of what I'm saying. I'm saying affirmative action in 1980 is one thing. Affirmative action in 2020 is a different thing. I'm saying affirmative action as a tool is one thing. Affirmative action as a crutch is a different thing. I'm saying that the base issue is the development of the capacities of African American people to perform. To the extent that affirmative action is developmental in its orientation, that is special attention to youngsters to give them the opportunities so that they can enhance their natural given talents and have the experiences that are necessary to allow them to compete, that's one thing. I'm saying that affirmative action is a cover for elite institutions so that they can present the right optics in their yearbooks. It's a different thing entirely. So I'm trying to make a nuanced argument. Not affirmative action is a banner that I'm waving. I'm for affirmative action, I'm for racial justice. But affirmative action is part of a more carefully conceived strategy for promoting equality of African Americans. Not titular headcount equality, baseline performance equality. We're not anywhere close to achieving that. And the affirmative action that the elite institutions use in order, as I say, for optics, may be coming at the expense of true equality for African Americans in the long run. That's the argument that I'm making. We can, have at me.
So then, in light of that, current affirmative action policies, diversity strategies need to be discontinued or modified or revised in some special way? Or what do you see as a kind of practical response to your observation, if it happens to be the correct one?
I mean, I don't know how to respond to you, Ed. You're asking me for a concrete program. If we don't have affirmative action, then what do we do? Okay, I'll try to respond. I'm running an institution, I've got people I'm selecting. At Brown, we get, 30,000 applications for a class, and we admit 1,800. So that's pretty selective, okay? There's various things that I can do. One of the things that I can do is have in my mind an implicit quota, and that's what it is. I have in my mind an implicit target. I want 8% or 10% or 12% of my entering class to be black, okay? I'm gonna do what I need to do to get that. That's not the only way to proceed. Do what I need to do to get that while remaining as selective and elite as I am. I'm admitting 1 in 16 or whatever it is applicants. So I can pick from the top down. I've got black applicants. I can pick from the top down and get my 8 or 10 or 12%. I've got white, Asian, Latino applicants. I can pick from the top down and get the target percentages that I'm going after. And then when I'm done with that, I may end up with a class in which my African American students, on average, are significantly less distinguished in terms of their exhibited academic skill. We measure these things by different instruments, and the tests are one of those instruments. The tests are not, the word of God. They're not a window onto the soul of the applicant. They're just a piece of information that allows me to assess the academic achievement of the applicant. And I can end up with substantial differences in my incoming class between the measured academic achievement of my African American students and others. That's one way to proceed. Rather than have my target be 12% and create a circumstance ex post facto in which there are substantial differences in the academic achievement of my black students and the others who are in the class, I'd have my goal be 8% or 6%. Rather than maintain my determination to be super elite and only select from 2 standard deviations above the mean in the distribution of academic instruments amongst my applicants, I could be more ecumenical in the way in which I admitted my class for everybody, not just for the African American students, for everybody. There are many margins that the university, I speak as an economist, a margin is simply a place where you make a decision to do more or less of something that's important to the thing that you care about. There are many margins on which a university can operate. One of them is on how elite the university is overall. Because if the university determines not to be so focused on test scores, it doesn't have to create a class with its 8 or 10 or 12% of African Americans in which the disparity in test scores is so different. That's the thing that I'm worried about. Now, you can tell me it doesn't matter. You can tell me that a student sitting in front of me that had a 790 on the SAT math and a 760 on the SAT verbal is not discernibly different in their performance from a student sitting in front of me who has a 650 on the SAT math and a 620 on the SAT verbal. I can tell you after 40 years of college teaching that I don't believe that. Test scores are not a window onto the person's soul, but they are correlated with performance. So what we're doing is we're creating a circumstance where there's actually objective differences in the post-admissions performance amongst the students. Oh God, I actually said it. How else could it be? I mean, this is simply logic. Either those test score differences among the students don't matter for anybody, or they do matter for people. And if they matter for people, then they matter when you have large racial differences in those scores for black people and people who are not black. That is not equality. I'm willing to wait for equality, Ed. I'm willing to go with 4% if that's what it takes, 5%, 7%. And I'm willing to be less elite. I'm willing to be less precious, less self-consciously trying to construct a meritocratic outcome in which racial differences in performance are put under the cover. No one wants to talk about it. Lies are perpetrated about it. I want equality for African American people. That means investment. My position is not laissez-faire. My position is not turn my back on the situation. That means putting money into schools. That means programs for developing the skills of youngsters who show promise in high school. That means maybe 5 years or 6 years of undergraduate training to get somebody to the point where they can really compete in the PhD program and they can be admitted, and so on and so forth. I could go down the list. Developmental affirmative action, not preferential affirmative action. I don't know, did I answer your question?
I think so.
Okay.
Shifting the emphasis a little bit, earlier on you made reference to a kind of change in your view on the category or the value of colorblindness. You said that that, you know, when I was young, we were preached that there was kind of deep, intimate connection between justice and blindness, impartiality, abstraction from color, et cetera, and so forth. Now the view is that, at least one view out there that's pretty prominent, is that claims or insistences on colorblindness represents a form of blindness in a way, that one needs to attend in very explicit and specific ways to racial identity, and a refusal to see race is in some sense to be blind to certain kinds of political realities. So there's been a major shift, I think, in public attitudes toward that value and concept. Now, I sense in your own trajectory, once again, that there has been a kind of development there, that you started out with a kind of maybe Martin Luther King-like commitment to colorblindness, and then you sort of shifted, moved away from that, and now you're wondering whether or not that shift was the appropriate way to go. What's involved in that, if I've got you correctly?
Okay, in terms of colorblindness, I was against it before I was for it, before I was against it, before I was for it. So in that dissertation that I described, I was against colorblindness. I was saying, look, history casts a very long shadow. There's the formal sector where you're going to impose your colorblind norms, but there's an informal sector where nobody is confused about that, and everybody knows what race their mate belongs to, and they're concerned about it. Adoption agencies know that the preference for adopting infants who are in need of parents differs based on the race of the people who are selling eggs for fertility treatment, know that the buyers of those eggs are concerned about the racial character, et cetera, et cetera. So what do you mean colorblindness? Okay, that's where I was. Then I became a Reagan conservative. In the 1980s, me and Clarence Thomas were buddies. And the catechism was, let's get beyond race. And I bought that. And it was an idealistic position. It was both politically untenable, but I think at the deepest philosophical level, it was inadequate, perhaps for reasons that you've hinted at. But, you know, I was swept up in the time, and it was what it was. I'm sure that Bracy, talks about all of this amongst the black conservatives of that era. And I found myself going along with it until we got to 1996, the California ballot proposition 209, when I was involved with a conservative organization that then Justice Thomas was very friendly towards, something called the Center for New Black Leadership. And we were asked to go out to California and join Ward Connerly. No one here will remember who he is, but he was a prominent businessman in California and an African American who was stridently opposed to affirmative action and who led the campaign for ballot Proposition 209, which was enacted in California and which banned affirmative action in government contracting and in college admissions in that state. He was successful in that campaign, 1996. And we were asked, the Center for New Black Leadership, of which I was the chair, to go out and campaign for it. And I thought about it. I thought about it very hard. On the one hand, I was kind of believing the mantra that we should be a colorblind society. On the other hand, I was also trying to make our organization credible with the African American public more broadly. I was trying to give Black people an opportunity to look at Black conservatism in a different light. You know, I mean, business development and whatnot, strong family values and whatnot. I mean, that's not anathema to Black people. And I thought if I went out to California and campaigned openly for ballot Proposition 209, I would destroy my credibility on any other issue with African Americans. And so I demurred, much to the chagrin of my colleagues. I ended up having to resign as chairman of the board of this small organization, small but well-funded, because the rest of the board were just, people were very annoyed with me. You know, Brother Shelby Steele, my friend, said, I thought we agreed. Well, we did agree. Justice Thomas in the background, very annoyed at the fact that I wasn't on board for that. But I pulled back. I blinked, if you like. And that was a part of a broader, this is about me and not everybody's going to be interested, but that was a part of a broader evolution in my thinking where I started moving to the left on a number of different issues, culminating in that book, Race, Incarceration, and American Values, 2008, which was a full-throated denunciation of the mass incarceration regime that was so detrimentally affecting the African American population. I was moving left more generally, and so this was a part of it. But for the reasons that I've already given voice to, I was watching what was going on in various institutions in the society through the 90s and into the current century and up to the present day. And I was concerned, for reasons that I've already given voice to, about whether or not the policy of racial preference was consistent with the aspiration of African Americans achieving equal status over the longer run. So I wouldn't take the principled position, even today, that we have to be colorblind. I think that's naive. And I think in the mouths of some people on the right, it's a trope, it's a move. They're really not interested in grappling with the problem of racial equality, and they're looking for cover. And so they repair to this posture, this supposedly idealistic posture, but ignore the reality of race going on in our lives. So I would say that. On the other hand, I do think at the end of the day that African Americans here are Americans, that the biggest challenges that we confront, at least in terms of public policy, require 50% plus one in support in order to be enacted into law. That the poverty that I think characterizes life for white people in, I don't know, J.D. Vance's Southwest Ohio and Eastern Kentucky, or in the trailer parks in Milwaukee that Matthew Desmond describes, I think, brilliantly in his Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Evicted, or whatever, opioid-addicted people who are suffering and whatnot. Many of those people are white people, not just Black people. And so I would say at the end of the day, the best way to frame social justice problems in the United States, for political reasons, but also for principled reasons, would not be to frame them mainly in terms of race. That's different from a stick-figured colorblindness that says, oh, race is over, let's move on. I don't see color anymore, okay? It's different from that. But it is a kind of principled colorblindness. I wouldn't want to use those terms. I would say transracial humanism. That would be the way that I would put it. I would say equal weight on the lives of all of our citizens. I would say all lives matter. But I would say it not as a rebuke of the social justice warriors who want police to stop shooting young Black men. I want them to stop shooting young Black men too. I would say it rather in the spirit of arguing that if we want to frame policy questions in America so that we can get our hands around them and solve them, we are best off to frame them in transracial terms. Doesn't mean I'm unaware of the fact that there's such a thing as implicit bias that might cause a police officer to shoot an innocent Black person. It means that I've actually looked at the Washington Post database on police shootings. Have anybody here looked at that database? You can find it just like that. Every single shooting that they can identify in the press and in official government documents is chronicled. Over 1,200 a year. They're all listed chronologically. You can go down the list, and there's a column that says race, and it says H for Hispanic, A for Asian, B for black, and W for white. And you just scan down that column. There's also a column for gender, sex. It says M for male and F for female. They're almost all M's. But under the column for race, a lot of them are W's. 1,200 or so people killed in the country every year by police officers. Only 300 or less of them are African American. Most of them are white. If I want to solve the problem of police killings, and I do, I would argue that the best way to frame that problem is in terms of the rights of citizens not to be preyed upon by officers of the state. Full stop. Saying that does not make me into a stick-figured advocate of colorblindness. I think rather it makes me into someone who understands something about the nature of our country, which is that the justice issues are transracial.
You mentioned the book on incarceration. I take it there's a kind of debate that was spawned by Michelle Alexander's book, where she characterizes the current incarceration system with the disproportionate punishment of blacks as a new Jim Crow, and therefore kind of systemic racism. And that view has been, to some degree, correct me if I'm wrong, challenged by Michael Fortner's work, where he tries to argue, he is an African American, he tries to argue that a good bit of the the formation of the drug laws during the Rockefeller period and so forth were motivated by members of the black community, and therefore it's a more complicated picture than Michelle Alexander makes it out to be. Do you have a position with respect to that particular debate now?
Yeah, I do. Michelle Alexander's book is called The New Jim Crow, as you noted. Michael Fortner is a political scientist at the City University of New York, African American, and his book, I believe, is called The Silent Black Majority. And it is a history of African American reaction to the drug problem in New York in the 70s and 80s and on up to the present day, and the extent to which grassroots revulsion at the consequences of open drug trafficking in black communities ended up leading to support for the draconian Rockefeller drug laws that were enacted in that state. A lot of black people were on Rockefeller's side, and probably those laws would have never been enacted into law if it hadn't been for the support from black communities. And he thinks that's a story worth telling. We should probably also mention Foreman's book, James Foreman, the Yale law professor, Locking Up Our Own, I think is what his book is called, which is a history of similar issues with a different intonation than Fortner, but nevertheless, and Foreman is focused on Washington, D.C. So I think Michelle Alexander's intervention was obviously very influential and was important, and raised the question of whether or not the extent to which the disparity and the hit of mass incarceration by race could be likened to, it could be understood as another instance of a very old American story of black subordination. I think it was overly simplistic and a little bit rhetorical, although it was, not without some evidence in an effort to support a view, but I don't think it told the whole story. And I actually think subsequent scholarship, and not only these books that we've mentioned, points out that the story is more complicated than that. For example, Michelle Alexander downplays violence. She argues as if every African American who's locked up is locked up because they were caught with a joint in their pocket and the cops are looking for them to have drugs and are therefore locking them up. Most people who are in prison in this country are not in prison for the simple possession of drugs. They're in prison for having committed violent crimes. What about the effect of violence on black communities? There's not a word of that in Michelle Alexander's text. Would a serious treatment of crime and punishment in America somehow manage not to discuss the implications of antisocial behavior amongst African Americans for other African Americans? Would a serious public policy discount those implications? I don't think so. She's telling part of the story, not all of the story. I think, this is Glenn Loury, our sentences are too long in America. I think there's so much plea bargaining that courts never have a chance to, and juries never have a chance to adjudicate the cases that are ambiguous and are difficult and exercise some sense of judgment before they consign somebody to 10 years or 20 years. I think 3 strikes and you're out, 3 felony offenses, and we're going to throw away the key, 25 years to life, is unconscionable. I think having more people per capita in prison for life without the possibility of parole than does the country of Sweden have per capita in prison for life for any reason. The numbers are about 50 per 100,000. About 50 people per 100,000 in America are in prison for life without the possibility of parole. And that's roughly the incarceration rate in Sweden for any length of time. Is despicable, okay? I also think that public order in urban areas where African Americans are concentrated is the first business of local government. I think being carjacked at a gasoline pump at 1 o'clock in the morning by somebody who puts an automatic weapon in my face, nobody should have to live like that, and it's the state's responsibility to see that it's not so. I think gangbangers rolling down the street, settling their beasts by popping their pistols out the window and shooting 6-year-olds who are sitting on their mother's lap is barbarity. And so somewhere between waving the bloody shirt of racism on the one hand and running around calling for lock 'em up and throw away the key on the other is to be found a defensible morally and politically public policy that recognizes the humility of African Americans, both those who offend and those who are preyed upon. That's where I'm trying to locate myself in this debate.
Okay, we're close to the time where we're going to begin Q&A from the general audience, beginning with Professor Anthony Battiza. I just want to say one thing before we do that and get your reaction, but it has to be brief.
Have I been answering at too great a
No,
length?
no.
I want to be understood, that's all.
Yeah. Reparations. Brief.
Okay, all right. You all can find on YouTube Paul Salmon, the economics editor at the NewsHour. PBS did a segment on reparations. He has myself and he has Professor William Darity and Darity's wife, I'm sorry, I don't remember her name now, on. And I'm arguing against, and of course Sandy Darity is arguing for. Darity's professor at Duke University. He and I were in graduate school together at MIT back in the 70s. Why am I against? Okay, let me just start by saying